My name is Ben. I'm here today to talk to you about a couple things related to fitness. There's a few things that go around the fitness community that are oversimplified or I think miscommunicated. And a lot of times the big YouTube names out there there's a couple that do it very well, but there's a couple that oversimplify things or assume that someone has a background in something and talk about it as if without actually breaking it down or explaining it. So I'm going to go ahead and explain a couple of the basic things people need to understand. And there's gonna be a bunch of episodes. I'm gonna talk about a bunch of different things. The first one, this is functional anatomy, because that's just the base of everything fitness related. So that's what we're gonna talk about today. I'm gonna go over bioenergetics or energy type during exercise, power versus strength versus hypertrophy, how to train for those different things, reps, sets, all that kind of different stuff, the mechanisms that go into that, fiber type composition, characteristics of muscle fiber, anatomy of muscle, all the different things, those are going to be covered. So today I'm talking about the very most simplistic thing I can and break it down in the easiest way without oversimplifying it. And those are the planes of movement and how the body moves, with also a couple names to help reference movement in the body. And that's why we have these, so you can talk in a way that's very understandable, right? And so there's no ambiguity. So the first thing is planes of movement. There's 3 cardinal planes of movement, and I picked the 3 most common names. There's a bunch of names for each one, but I picked the most common ones. So the first is the sagittal plane, divides the body up into the left and right halves. And common movements that occur in that are flexion and extension. We'll get into that in a second. There's the frontal plane, which divides you into front and back pieces, right? So through the middle of the body into front and back. And then there's also the transverse plane, cuts you into top and bottom halves, okay? So everything is half, and it's just different which one or which part of the body you're cutting, okay? So the first one and the simplest one to understand for most people is the bicep curl. And this occurs in the sagittal plane, and it's flexion and extension. So in the elbow, it's another thing you refer to when you're talking about movement, is what joint that muscle is acting at. So for example, the biceps brachii, most commonly referred to, is at the elbow. Flexion, or the shortening of a joint angle. That's what flexion means. And there's extension. The triceps, for example, do extension. They extend this angle and make it bigger. Those are just 2 examples in the arm that occurs everywhere. The same thing, flexion and extension of the knee, So getting longer, the angle is 100% extended. Here it's flexed. Same thing at the hip. Flexion at the hip, extension. And there's different muscles that do each one of those, some that cross over both. We'll get into that. The second plane of movement, or common things in that plane, is the frontal plane. So again, in the front and back halves, there's abduction, meaning moving further away from the body, or adduction, coming closer. And it's commonly referred to as abduction and adduction, so it's understood clearly which one you're talking about. There's certain muscles that do that, like at the shoulder joint, the deltoids, lateral deltoids, abduct the shoulder. The chest and the lats adduct the shoulder. We'll get into that too. And those transverse movements are usually rotational. So some type of trunk rotation, internal rotation of the shoulder, rotation of the forearm. Another important thing to understand real quick is anatomical position. So movements are most commonly described from anatomical position, which means like this, with the hands pointed out. Everything is referred to from this position. That's the basis of basically everything. You can still refer to things in different positions, but that's the structure and the function of everything else. So on top of all those, there's a few things that you'll need to know when talking about different muscles. And they're names to describe the position of muscles. So, for example, there's inferior and superior. So obviously superior is closer to the top, inferior is below. I'm sure you guys have heard these names before. There's medial and lateral. Medial means closer to the midline. Lateral is further away from the midline. Those are the 4 most basic and easiest to understand. There's a bunch more as well. We'll get into those later as need be, but just know that those are ways to describe the movement. So, for example, the core muscles are located inferior to the pecs. That would be one example. Now, to get into something that's also very commonly misunderstood or oversimplified is joint action and muscle action. So the easiest way to think about where a muscle is acting, and this is important if you want to reduce injury risk so you understand what you're moving. So just know that when you're doing a pull day, there might be push muscles that are working on that day. Something else that's also misunderstood or never talked about is there's 3 types of muscle action. There's concentric, eccentric, and isometric. Now, each of these have different characteristics and they occur in different ways. The most commonly understood is concentric, or shortening of the muscle. So for example, my chest is producing concentric movement during a fly. It's shortening, and you can see as you're pulling across That's what's happening. And muscles can only pull. Push and pull day is a very common description people use, but in reality, to produce concentric movement, muscles can only shorten to produce that. What is eccentric? Just quickly, means lengthening under tension, right? So if you're on the way down of a bench press, your chest is lengthening under tension. That's an eccentric movement. Isometric, literally iso meaning same, metric meaning movement, same movement or same length, metric meaning length. So same length. So if I were holding right here in a push-up, that's isometric hold. No movement is occurring. A couple things I want to talk about now is simple little things. There's difference between push and pull muscles. So one of the most commonly used is the biceps, right? So flexion of the biceps brachii. Now this is an important muscle. I'm going to use this as an example because it has multiple different movements at multiple different joints because it crosses 3 joints. And that's what you want to know. If a muscle crosses that joint or a joint, it will have an action at that joint. And the bicep is the easiest one for people to understand because it's the most commonly visualized and everybody wants to have big biceps. So the first function of the biceps is flexion of the elbow, right here. It also has a function in the transverse plane, which is supination, which is pulling and rotating the arm out. That happens here because of the supinator and the biceps brachii. The third function, which it crosses the shoulder, and this is the one that most people are not aware of. That's why also, back to the supination, why you have more force generation capacity when you're doing pull-ups when your hands are rotated in compared to out, like this, compared to pronated, is because the biceps don't act when the hands are pronated. They have to be, not have to be, but for them to be effective at pulling in their action, they need to be supinated. But it also has an action at the shoulder. So if in the sagittal plane, flexion and extension of the shoulder. The biceps connects at the shoulder, therefore it has an action at the shoulder. Not only does it flex here, it also flexes the shoulder. So when you're doing something like flies, it's going to have an action and contribute to this movement. It's not going to be a prime mover. That's something else to understand is there's prime movers and secondary movers for every action and for every muscle type of contraction. And those are the easiest ones to understand is this has flexion at the shoulder. It's a secondary mover. It means it's not the majority contributor, but it does contribute. And that's important to understand if you just did a back and biceps day, the next day you're doing a chest day, you're doing high volume or high intensity, and you're going into chest flies, you gotta be aware if your biceps are very sore, they do have an action at the shoulder, and you can be damaging that if you're overworking it. We'll get into overtraining and other things like that later on, but for now, a couple more points, major points in this episode. I'm gonna talk about the pec function, just to give you guys another type of understanding. So, there's 2 heads to the pec. There's the clavicular head and the sternocostal head. They have different insertion, they have different origins, same insertion. They have different functions, and some that are the same, some that work synergistically. For example, one of the functions that's most common that people understand, because we do it all the time, is flies, or horizontal abduction. That's another one that occurs in the transverse plane of motion because it's coming across the body. Normally it's rotation, but in this case, anything, as you can see, pulling through that same, like if you were to cut me in left and right, bring that plane up here, it occurs. The plane extends indefinitely, so any motion that occurs is going to be in that plane. The chest acts both ways. You also have other movers, don't let me oversimplify in that sense. The anterior deltoids also act in that situation as well, but the primary mover is going to be your pecs. They work together in that. To separate the movements out, your clavicular head of the pec only acts here and will act without the sternocostal head in flexion. Because of its unique position on the clavicle, right here, it pulls down and across, so it will pull up. As you can see, if it were to shorten, it pulls the muscle up, right? The biceps are also contributing to that movement, as well as the anterior deltoid. Another one I want to talk about is the sternocostal head of the pec. Most people will not think of this because they don't understand that the sternocostal head actually causes extension. Now, when I just did that movement, most people will be familiar with the row. Extension. And they'd say that the lats, posterior deltoids, and the teres major are working. Well, you'd be correct in saying that, but it's not the only muscle. And the only way that the chest actually works in that is when it actually has the line of pull. So you have to think about where the muscle goes. The chest, the sternocostal head of the pec, has an action of extension at the shoulder on its own, without the clavicular head. And it works from here, because you can see the line of pull here, it can help initiate that movement. It's not going to be a prime mover in extension, but it will help initiate that movement. The triceps are actually the same way. They extend the elbow, they actually help extend the shoulder in the same position that the pecs do. Another quick example to give you just how the nuances of functional anatomy is the deltoids, right? The deltoids will change their function based on the position of your hand. They have unique functions, but they also have common functions. They all insert at the same spot called the deltoid tuberosity. So all three of these muscles, there's three heads of the deltoid, all insert in the same area. Now one of the commons is abduction. All three of the heads of the deltoid can contribute in abduction depending on the position of the hand. If I pull out here, the anterior deltoid is going to have a much better angle of pull based on its insertion than the medial or lateral deltoid. The lateral deltoid here, the further you rotate in, posterior has a better line of pull to produce that action. Another thing that happens in abduction is, we've all heard of the rotator cuff muscles. Well, one of them contributes to this movement, but it contributes only 10% of abduction. That's the supraspinatus. So it helps initiate that movement, get the force out from under. Up to here, the deltoids are acting. Beyond that, there's a different mover, and it's back to the chest, the clavicular head. Now has, above 90%, an ability to pull to continue produce the movement of abduction. So that's just a few upper body examples. I'll give you another couple. I'll give you one more quick example, and that's the squat action at the hip. So there's a squat and the deadlift. And these occur primarily if you were to keep it 100% in the sagittal plane, flexion and extension of the hips, the knees, and the ankles. I'll get into more specifics. If you guys want me to, leave a message, leave a comment down below. I'll go into the specifics of these functions, of these muscles, where exactly they insert and they originate. If you want that type of detail, just let me know. But for example, the squat and the deadlift is another common misconception. People think they work different muscles. They work identical muscles. It's just which ones are in preference and which ones are not. So for example, when you're pulling from the floor, right here is the deadlift, your hips are extending, your knees are extending, and your ankles are extending. Those movements are called triple extension. They're great for sporting activities. That's why they're such foundational movements. Now, the last thing I'll say about this is these muscles work the same whether you're here or whether the weight is here. It just depends where the emphasis is based on the position of the weight. Okay? So, first thing is there's extension here. That's going to occur no matter what is happening, whether the weight is here or the weight is here. It has to be a type of extension. So, the same muscles, the hamstrings, the glutes are going to extend the hip. The quads are going to extend the knee, and the gastrocnemius are going to extend the ankle. Those are all going to be contributing just in different ways depending on where the weight is. Similar to the abduction, depending on the position of the hand. There's much more nuances, as if you were to angle the feet out, it would change what part of the quads are affected. It will change the activation of the hip muscles. So, I hope what I said was clear. Let me know down below in the comments what you guys would like to learn about. I have a couple preset ideas, but if there's anything you guys are curious about or think that I could shed some light on, please let me know. I appreciate any type of criticism or feedback, so leave that down below as well. I'll do what I can to improve. Thank you guys for watching. Drop a like. See you later.